Mr. President, I want to speak to another matter this afternoon, a matter that really, as I think about my tenure here in the Senate and those initiatives that I have been engaged with that have really touched me in a way that just make me want to work all that much harder, because it is so challenging, it is so difficult, and in many, many ways it's so dark that anything that I can do to shine a light on it, I will do so. I came to the Senate floor 2 years ago, joined by my former colleague from North Dakota, Senator Heidi Heitkamp. And Heidi was here on the floor speaking about a bill that she had introduced, Savannah's Act. But together, we were really working to speak to the urgency of addressing this epidemic, if you will, this growing number of missing and murdered Native women across America. The awful truth in this country is that Native women are victims of violence in unprecedented proportions. And when I say unprecedented, I'll just give you some of the Alaska numbers to just kind of put it into perspective here. This month, October, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so in many of the communities and states across the country, we've been focused on these issues of domestic violence and what more we can do to address these issues of concern and safety. Well, on October 1st, the first day of this month where we're raising this awareness, the headlines in the state's largest newspaper stated that the rate of rape in the state of Alaska was up 11% between 2017 and 2018, an 11% increase in 1 year. And we're a state where, unfortunately, Alaska Native women are 2.5 times more likely to be a victim of domestic violence. In tribal villages and Native communities, domestic violence rates are up to 10 times higher than the rest of the nation, 10 times higher. So think about as bad as it is in areas that you are in. But in our tribal villages and some of the Native communities, these rates are staggering. In 2015, it was estimated that 40% of sex trafficking victims were Native Americans. Now, I know 2015 was a few years ago, but 40% of the victims who've been sex trafficked were Native Americans. The rate of sexual violence victimization amongst Alaska Native women is at least 7 times greater than non-Native females in the state. So think about that. There is a level, an unprecedented level of victimization, of assault, of violence, of murder that is experienced by Alaska Native women. And these are statistics that really should shock the conscience. I know they shock mine, and yet I've been exposed to them for so many years, but it continues to shock. But we all know that these are not just statistics. These are mothers, these are sisters, these are aunts, these are cousins, these are friends. And these are people, women, who are being violated at rates that are unacceptable anywhere in any state. Now, I mentioned that some of the statistics are old, and that is part of the problem, trying to understand what it is that we don't know. And so we need to get updated data. But what isn't old, and what is unfortunately seemingly every day, we get new statistics that are added to what we have already known. It was just last week, family and friends packed an Anchorage courtroom for the arraignment of a man who had been charged with murdering 52-year-old Veronica Abuchuk. She was a Native woman, originally from the village of St. Michael, had been in Anchorage for a period of time. She'd been reported missing earlier this year, and then she was found dead near the Old Glen Highway in April. And it was just a few weeks ago now, maybe about 3 weeks ago, our community, the Alaska community, was just horrified as we learned through the news of a video, a video cartridge that had been found on a street. And what it revealed was a tape of torture and abuse of a Native woman. That tape ultimately led to the arrest of this same man that is accused of killing Veronica. But that video showed the torture and the murder of 30-year-old Kathleen Jo Henry. She was originally from a very small village, the village of Eek. So these are stories. These are women who we read of what they have experienced, what they have endured, and think about their families that no longer have these women in their life, and you just can't view them in the abstract as statistics. And so what we're doing to respond to them as women that are vulnerable and are being preyed upon, what are we doing to act to help? So I mentioned that this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. In Alaska, we've started calling it Domestic Violence Action Month. Going from awareness to action is really the key here. Because I'm here to tell you, in Alaska, we are very aware of how severe the problem of violence against Native women is, whether it's domestic violence and assault to then being trafficked and murdered. We know the statistics. When I'm talking with Alaskans about what we're seeing with missing and murdered Indigenous women, the subject of trafficking keeps coming into every conversation, because that's what's seemingly happening to so many who unfortunately go missing. There's far, far, far too many stories that we then hear that they have become trafficked and then ultimately murdered. This nexus here is what is really frightening. So I mentioned the data and understanding what it is that we know and what we don't know. How big is the problem? What is happening with our Native women, that they are being victimized to the extent and to the level that we see? So we're beginning to make some progress. We're beginning to gather more data and understanding. There's a lot we know that we've got to learn. But one thing that has become clear is that these crimes are permeating cities across America. They're in the cities, but they're also in our small, remote, and rural communities. There's really no geographic boundary that we're talking about here. Initially, we had thought that the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was primarily a problem on the remote Indian reservations. But we had some good, strong reporting from the Seattle-based Urban Indian Health Institute. And we learned a lot there about the gaps in the data. We learned that the number of Native women that go missing in urban centers is as significant as those that go missing on reservations or in rural areas. In fact, last year there were 507 cases of Native women who were killed in urban areas. Of those, 282 were confirmed murdered, 127 were confirmed missing, and 98 cases are still listed in an unknown status. And these cases exist across 71 urban areas selected for the study, from Baltimore and Orlando on the East Coast all the way up to the North Slope in the community of Utqiagvik. According to the report, Anchorage was among the top 10 cities identified in the study, coming in at number 3 with 21 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Overall, Alaska was the 4th highest state in the nation with 52 cases. But keep in mind that these are just the cases that have actually been reported. So making sure that we're understanding the extent of the problem, the issue that we're dealing with, the spotlight that we're shining on the issue of murdered Indigenous women is growing. But we need to answer those questions so, again, we can move from awareness to action. So what are we doing? How are we doing? We are keenly focused, I am certainly keenly focused on what we can do to improve public safety in Alaska. As shocking as many of these statistics are that I have shared with you, what we know is that in far, far, far too many communities in our state, we lack law enforcement presence. These are remote communities, these are small communities, maybe 300 people. But when you don't have law enforcement, when there's nobody there who can administer justice, who can be the law effectively, it's a safe place for bad people to go and do bad things. And so what we do to address this is on all of us. So as we're looking at public safety in rural Alaska, as I reminded Attorney General Barr when he participated in a video conference at the Alaska Federation of Native Convention a couple weeks ago, he made the comment that we want to make sure that we have public safety throughout Alaska, and that a woman shouldn't have to move to the city to feel safe. And I unfortunately had to remind him that in the cities, unfortunately, we're not seeing the level of safety that we would seek. But we are making some headway, and I want to share with colleagues what we have just done in this Interior Appropriations Bill that we moved through the full Senate just this afternoon. I thank colleagues for that support. But for the first time, we are directing real dollars to prioritize the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have included a specific focus there within the Interior Appropriations Bill for FY 2020. We provide funding to address the crisis with support for cold case investigations, equipment, training, and background checks. So we're working, this will be an effort that we will work with Department of Justice, with the BIA, with the administration, with the state, with the tribes. We also encourage the Indian Health Service to look at programs which can help educate community health aides on trauma-informed care, which also includes collecting medical evidence. Through the CJS Appropriations Bill that we passed, we build upon efforts to address the high rates of violence that are experienced in far too many Alaskan communities. So we've been advocating for the largest possible Victims of Crime Act fund set aside for Native communities who disproportionately face violence and have oftentimes extremely limited access to service. We also secured significant funding for the Violence Against Women Prevention and Prosecution programs. And for state and local law enforcement and tribal assistance, we provide additional resource, as well as resourcing for the COPS, the Community-Oriented Policing Services Program, which is an initiative to increase the number of police officers and ensure that they're properly trained. So I think we're making some headway on the appropriations side, but I think we know that there is more that we can do. We know that there is more that we must do. I thank the Attorney General Barr. He came up to the state of Alaska in May at the invitation of Senator Sullivan and myself, and many of our leaders around the state, including our tribal leaders, and he was able to sit down at round tables in Anchorage. He was able to get up to Fort Yukon, up on the Yukon River, come down to Bethel, and to go out to a small village of Napaskiak, a community of about 350 people. And following his visit, he was so struck by what he had heard, what he had seen, and truly what he felt in his heart, that he moved forward with a designation of a public safety emergency in the state of Alaska. He has been working with us to help specifically address how we can make these rural communities more safe, what we can be doing with everything from training to basic infrastructure. So it is something that we're working collaboratively on. We're also seeing so many individuals, organizations, communities really speaking up about this issue, because again, it's like the data. If you don't know it, you can't respond to it. But if the stories aren't shared, as hard and awful as they are, it is difficult to know how we respond. So there's so many who are speaking up in different ways to bring light to the fact that so many Native women have not received justice. It's a woman by the name of Amber Webb, who I met when I was in Fairbanks for the AFN conference, and she has created this really powerful visual symbol to honor missing and murdered women. She sketched the faces of more than 200 missing and murdered Indigenous women from across North America, and she sketched them on a giant white cuspuk. Cuspuk is the traditional garb of a woman, and she chose the cuspuk because it symbolizes the adaptability and the strength of Native women. And it's pretty impressive. It's about 15 feet high. But again, white cuspuk with the portraits, the sketches of these women. In the center is the face of not a woman, but a young girl, Ashley Johnson Barr, who was a 10-year-old girl who was kidnapped and killed in Kotzebue last year. Being at Ashley's memorial services with the entire community of Kotzebue, probably felt like the whole region, grieving the loss of that child in that brutal and awful murder in her home was something that never leaves you. On one sleeve of the cuspuk is sketched the face of Sophie Sergey. Sophie was killed in 1993. She was at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, in one of the dorms, and her case was cold for 25 years. 25 years, her family had no idea who brutally killed her and left her in a bathtub of blood in a campus dorm room. And that case broke loose with some DNA testing not too many months ago, and that family is hoping that one day there will be justice for their daughter. But the faces on that cuspuk represent way, way, way too many lives lost. some of what we're facing in Alaska when it comes to public safety is really the lack of public safety out in rural areas, and just an inability to ensure that that people are safe in their homes. And so when you look at the statistics that we have, when you look at the issues that you face, sometimes you have to say, maybe the way that we've been doing things for this long just isn't working out in these areas. Maybe there needs to be a different dynamic. And so I have recently introduced what we're calling the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Empowerment Act. It builds on a legislative provision that Congressman Young has introduced, but it's a pilot for Alaska tribes to address violence against Native women. And in that bill, we empower tribes to exercise domestic violence criminal jurisdiction on a pilot basis, similar to what we did in VAWA 2013 for those in Indian country. But we allow tribes to assume local control over local public safety matters, because we cannot allow for, we cannot deny safety or justice to an individual based on jurisdictional issues. We just cannot. And so this addresses one critical piece, and that's the tribal empowerment. But there's another very important element, and that is coordination amongst law enforcement agencies. I hear way too often from Alaskans who tell me that they don't actually count a missing Native woman as missing, because the last time anybody saw her, she met somebody, she left the village, went to Anchorage, nobody ever really heard of her again. But what we know is that one of the most vulnerable times for these young women is the transition from a village to a hub community or to a city. And we've heard from law enforcement that Native people, especially these young Native girls, are targeted by traffickers when they first arrive in Anchorage or Fairbanks or a hub community. So it's important that we both understand the scope of the problem and address coordination between our state, our federal, and our tribal governments. And that's what Savannah's Act and this counterpart legislation, the Not Invisible Act, do together. So I reintroduced Savannah's Act earlier with Senator Cortez Masto earlier this year. This was an effort, again, that I was proud to carry the torch for Senator Heitkamp, who has truly been a leader on this issue. But our bill combats the epidemic of murdered and missing Native women and girls by improving the federal government's response to addressing the crisis. Savannah's Act increases coordination among all levels of law enforcement, increases data collection and information sharing, and empowers tribal governments with the resources that they need in cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls wherever they occur. This second bill that I've mentioned with Senator Cortez Masto is the Not Invisible Act. Because what we've seen for far too long is Native families and communities have mourned the loss of family members, sometimes with resolution of their cases of a murdered sister or a missing loved one, but often the cases remain unsolved. As I mentioned earlier, we were shocked in Alaska by the case of Kathleen Jo Henry and the related case of Victoria Abachuk. But what is just as shocking is that the Abachuk family has already experienced the loss of one of their sisters, Martha Toms, who was killed in 2005 and whose case is still unsolved. So they have had tragedy compounded on tragedy. So these bills, Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, attempt to bring the issue of violence against Native women and the ongoing epidemic of missing and murdered Indians to the attention of the nation. These families have faced unspeakable loss and until recently have felt almost invisible, frustrated, and really, I'm just let down by the system, the complex system that was supposed to protect them. But to truly honor the memory of Savannah LaFontaine Graywin and acknowledge her family's loss, we have to close the jurisdictional loopholes that criminals exploit. We have to improve the coordination among law enforcement at all levels of government, and we have to provide the necessary resources. So Not Invisible designates an official in BIA to coordinate violent crime protection efforts across federal agencies. It also establishes a commission of local, tribal, and federal stakeholders to make recommendations to the Department of Interior and Department of Justice on how to combat this epidemic of disappearances, homicide, violent crime, and trafficking of Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Mr. President, we have a trust responsibility, we know, to our Native people, but we have a duty of moral trust when we talk about keeping all Americans safe, and we all have to be part of the solution. So by passing these bills, we're saying we are not going to accept what we have dealt with, what we have faced for far too long. So I think that we have to have a sense of urgency to keep Native women and girls safe. And it shouldn't be anything that is partisan. There's nothing partisan about trying to protect women, nothing partisan about trying to protect Native women. It's not Republican or Democrat about the reality that we all deserve to have the same level of protection and justice as every other woman in this country. So I am back here on the Senate floor with the same message that I had a couple years ago with Senator Heitkamp, and that is to urge colleagues to move beyond awareness to action. Let's take up Savannah's Act. Let's take up Not Invisible. Let's act. Let's provide for the safety that all these women should expect.